Hi, my name is Johnny Kinsman. If you've ever seen me speak in person, I have no doubt mentioned my two great little boys, Oscar and Sam. In the past few weeks, I've enjoyed a lot of outside time with these little guys, and we find ourselves returning over and over to the Old North Bridge in Concord to bask in the beauty of the surroundings. I began mulling over in my mind the possibility of making a video to share with you. These little boys fill my days with joy. They are my life. But in the current situation we're in, with the kindergarten closed, the daycare closed, all the playgrounds closed, all the museums closed, all the babysitters and all the grandparents keeping sensible social distance, the inflection of that nice sentiment has changed to, they are my life. Time for filmmaking has been scarce. So I decided to capture whatever footage I could during the day and do the bulk of the talking at night, now that the boys are asleep, from the comfort of my basement. I mean, fancy television studio. I hope you enjoy it. Patriots Day in Massachusetts, a state holiday accompanied by Red Sox games, the Boston Marathon, family barbecues, town parades, all of these wonderful acts of joy have been sparked by a very solemn event, and that is the beginning of the American Revolution, the battles of Lexington and Concord, collectively known as the shot heard round the world. Now, in order to understand the enormity of what happened in Concord on April 19th, 1775, it helps to have a little bit of background and the events leading up to it. So I'll put it this way. Politics were a mess. In Boston, everybody was disgruntled, and the economy was bad, and people in the streets were bickering and arguing and fighting, and nobody knew how tense it was better than General Thomas Gage. This poor man was the military governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and this was a job that he got almost by mistake. You see, King George III of England was growing increasingly annoyed by Boston and the antics, and why won't they just pay what they owe? Now, in George III's defense and the Parliament's defense, from what they saw, they were spending a great deal of money protecting Bostonians from outside villains like the French or the Indians, and that's what the whole French and Indian War was about. They wanted to maintain control of the continent, England that is. Well, the Massachusetts side of this was saying, look, yeah, you've sent redcoats over and you've sent resources over, but we have fought side by side with you. Why must we now pay for that privilege? Well, okay, this went on, and poor Thomas Gage made an offhanded remark to King George III, talking about the strife in North America, and he said something to the effect of, well, I'm sure if the British Army showed true force, the Patriots would lay down like dogs in the streets. Something to that effect. Well, King George III said, that's wonderful, you're hired. And Thomas Gage was like, what? So next thing you know, Thomas Gage is installed in Boston, which is a political hotbed and a nightmare. I will add also that Thomas Gage had a wonderful marriage to an American woman. And so he is feeling loyalty to the crown and duty to the Parliament and all of this, but he also is trying to have a nice time at home. And his wife has political leanings that are more sympathetic to the American cause. And so Thomas Gage, after years and years of nonsense, the Stamp Act, the Tea Party, the Boston Massacre, he is in a mess and he needs a win. And so he comes up with a plan. And that plan is to recover the ammunition and gunpowder and cannons that have been stolen by the American militia. It's an open secret in Boston. Every morning a cannon goes missing, 6 barrels of gunpowder are gone. Who's stealing them? The militia that's been marching around town showing themselves off. And so Thomas Gage received intelligence that there was a cache of Patriot ammunition and Patriot gunpowder in Concord, Massachusetts. So the plan becomes sending roughly 700 of his finest soldiers from Boston to Concord in the middle of the night so as not to alarm the countryside, to seize those weapons back and break the back of this budding revolution. What Thomas Gage did not know is that there was another quarterback on the field, if you will, and that was Dr. Joseph Warren. Now, Joseph Warren was a well-respected physician in town, and he had dealings with every stripe of society, young and old, rich and poor, and he was a trusted man. And so, Joseph Warren was the head of the spy network that was reporting the activities of the British Army to the entire Patriot network and the revolutionaries. When Joseph Warren found out that Gage was going to send soldiers out to Concord, he started to panic. He needed to get word to Concord for the Patriots there to hide or move all the gunpowder and the muskets and the cannons. But also, Joseph Warren needed to get his friends out of Lexington. Lexington is right next to Concord, Massachusetts, and it is on the way from Boston to Concord in the route that the British soldiers were marching. What was special about Lexington is that John Hancock and Samuel Adams had been hiding out there since the Boston Tea Party. John Hancock and Sam Adams were suspected of planning and orchestrating the Boston Tea Party, and the Boston Tea Party was something that George III just could not abide. And so Joseph Warren was afraid that if the British soldiers happened upon Hancock and Adams in Lexington, they would be seized, arrested, shipped to England, and hanged for treason. So, Joseph Warren turned to someone he knew he could trust. Now I'm going to pause just to give you this backstory because it's one of my favorites. Joseph Warren, as a doctor, receives a visit from a guy who has a sore arm. And Warren starts to look at the arm and he sees that there is a coat button embedded in the skin of this arm. And the wound is in rough shape. It's infected. And Warren says to the patient, "How did this happen?" And the patient says, "It's not important. Can you fix it?" Well, Joseph Warren fixes the wound, but he also knows that the only thing that could have embedded a man's own coat button into his arm was to lift something very, very heavy. And a few days prior to this patient visiting Warren, a British cannon had been carted off in the middle of the night right from under the nose of the sentry who was supposed to guard it. And so Joseph Warren realized that this guy lifted the cannon, had the coat button embedded in his arm, stifled the scream that would have resulted, carried it off, and then continued to keep his mouth shut about how he was injured, even when speaking to a known revolutionary like Joseph Warren. So this is a guy you can trust. Well, the patient's name with the coat button arm, his name was William Dawes. Joseph Warren asks William Dawes to get to Lexington in the middle of the night. And he sends him on the land route out of Boston. That was the only way you could go if you were going on land. It was called Boston Neck. Joseph Warren also had another guy in mind, Paul Revere. Paul Revere lived in the north end of Boston. He was a messenger for the Patriot cause, and he had made this journey several times to Lexington, to Concord. Paul Revere was always out riding, carrying messages from Boston to the Patriots in the surrounding communities. So, Paul Revere's ride is one of my favorite topics. It's something I could go on and on and on about. In the interest of brevity, I'm going to try to just give you the highlights. Paul Revere gets the word from Joseph Warren that he must get to Lexington to warn Hancock and Adams of the British Army approach. Paul Revere leaves Joseph Warren, goes to his home, picks 2 lanterns up that he made himself for just this occasion. He goes to the North Church, which is in his neighborhood, and he speaks to a buddy of his, most likely Robert Newman, the sexton of the church, who was a disgruntled patriot who had British officers lodging in his house. Paul Revere tells Robert Newman to climb to the steeple, hold the lanterns up as a signal across to Charlestown to other riders in case Paul Revere did not make it across. Well, what does he mean, make it across? He had to row from Boston to Charlestown, and the harbor was closed. And to make matters even worse, there was a British man of war, HMS Somerset, at anchor in the exact ferry route that Paul Revere and his 2 buddies were going to use to get from the North End over to Charlestown. Well, a lunar anomaly prevented the sentries on top of the HMS Somerset from seeing Paul Revere and his 2 buddies rowing underneath the hull of the boat. Paul Revere gets to Charlestown, gets on a borrowed horse named Brown Beauty, and this horse is a mixture of an Arabian racehorse and an American farm horse. Fast and strong and sturdy and smart. And so Paul Revere is riding and riding and riding in the moonlight, and it's just turning into a very pleasant ride when all of a sudden the horse gets spooked and there are British soldiers on horseback. So Paul Revere turns Brown Beauty around and outruns the British sentries, changes the route of his midnight ride, and still makes it to Lexington very quickly, alerting people all along the way. Just a few minutes later, William Dawes also arrives in Lexington. They warn John Hancock and Sam Adams of the approaching British Army. Everybody gets out of town. William Dawes, Paul Revere, decide to go from Lexington to Concord to warn them to hide the ammunition. They happen to meet up with another patriot, Dr. Samuel Prescott. He had been out late speaking with a lady he was courting. And so they exchange words. They say, okay, you're cool, you're cool. Yeah, we're cool. All right, I'll help you spread the word because the people around here know me. This is Samuel Prescott speaking. Well, as they're riding along, warning people of the danger, they get caught. Paul Revere gets captured. William Dawes escapes one way. Samuel Prescott escapes the other way. Paul Revere lies convincingly enough to convince his captors that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of soldiers coming from every direction. They get spooked. They let Paul Revere go. Paul Revere, having evaded capture, manages to walk back to Lexington and pick up a trunk of John Hancock's papers that were very, very sensitive and very damning if gotten into the wrong hands. And he's carrying this trunk into the woods to safety just as the British column is marching into the town. And on Lexington Green, they see a band of local militia led by Captain John Parker. Now, Parker was the leader of the Lexington Minutemen. And let me illuminate the distinction between militia and Minutemen. Since British people started living on this continent, every town worth its weight had a militia. But given the political unrest of the 1770s, suddenly all of the local militia seem a little bit more well-heeled and a little bit more well-trained. And from that group of volunteers, they decided to create a special force. This force was to equip and hold itself in readiness at the shortest notice. Minutemen. Captain John Parker led his Lexington Minutemen to the Green to face off against the British Army, being led at that point by Major John Pitcairn. Now, Major John Pitcairn was a very quotable character. As he led the troops into town and saw the Minutemen on the Green, he said, "Lay down your arms, you damned rebels, and disperse." Captain John Parker, realizing that he is very much outnumbered, decides to give the order to disperse. And as the the Minutemen are dispersing from the green, a shot goes off. No one knows who fired it, but it led to a British volley of gunfire and then bayonets. 8 Minutemen were dead as the sun rose over Lexington Green on April 19th. I don't want to get mired in the gory details, but suffice to say that some of these Minutemen had a gruesome end. The tragedy was palpable, and imagine the insult when, in the moments after all of this happened, the British soldiers in Lexington gave a grand cheer and started up the fife and drum and continued marching to Concord. Meanwhile, in Concord, Dr. Samuel Prescott had arrived in the middle of the night. He rang alarm bells. He told all of his friends. They all started riding off in every direction to get more and more militia, more and more Minutemen to Concord to face the threat. Colonel James Barrett received word that the British soldiers were actually coming, and so he began frantically hiding all of the ammunition and gunpowder that was still left on his farm. The Concord militia musters. The Acton Minutemen arrive. The Lincoln Minutemen arrive. From all over Middlesex County, people are waking up in the middle of the night and walking to Concord and to Lexington. In this story, there are not many moments of humor, but I find the following story to be humorous. Please allow me. It's 6:30 in the morning. People have been woken up from every surrounding town. Guys have gotten their guns, gotten their boots, gotten their powder, gotten their musket balls, and marched to Concord to find out what's going on. They hear that there has been gunfire in Lexington, so they decide, about 150 guys decide they are going to walk to Lexington and see what's happening. And so they are walking and walking down the road, and all of a sudden they see the British Army coming toward them, playing fifes and drums. And they do some quick math and they realize that they are outnumbered roughly 4-1. Well, rather than hiding, they decided to step out onto the road and start playing their own fife and drum music and march right back into the center of Concord. I just think it's great. How confusing must this have been for the people of Concord? And imagine the British soldiers at the front of the column. I'm sorry, what are they doing now? Who are they? Are they with us? No? Let's keep marching anyway, I suppose. I mean... Thank you for indulging me. Back to the story at hand. One of my favorite images from the collection of artifacts we have from April 19th is an etching by Amos Doolittle of the British Army marching into the town of Concord. The vantage point of the artist is atop a hill, which is a graveyard in Concord Center, which still exists today. And the reason I love it is I grew up in Concord. I grew up staring down that hill into the town, and you can still see remnants of what the town used to look like from that vantage point even today. Now, in this etching, there are 2 officers. One has a spyglass, one does not. Well, these 2 officers are Major John Pitcairn, who sparked the gunfire in Lexington just, an hour prior, and Major General Francis Smith. This guy is one of the major reasons that the entire British expedition to Lexington and Concord was a complete failure. Smith was a man who loved order, and for this reason, General Gage trusted him But what this amounted to in the wee hours, when the British soldiers were supposed to be secreting themselves out of Boston and landing in Cambridge and beginning a march very quickly, is that Smith was sitting there arranging them by battalion and arranging them by type of soldier and making them wait for Navy provisions that were supposed to be delivered to them. And once they finally got there, after hours and hours of waiting, they were crackers covered in maggots. And so the soldiers threw them away, and all of this waiting was for nothing. And Smith was just, it was like dragging an anchor from Boston out to Lexington and to Concord. And so Francis Smith and John Pitcairn are up on the hill surveying the scene. Meanwhile, near the North Bridge, the Concord militia has mustered under Colonel James Barrett. The Acton Minutemen have arrived, being led there by Isaac Davis. Minutemen, militia from all the surrounding towns, trying to figure out what exactly to do. They're safely hidden. They see smoke pouring out of the town center, and they realize that the British soldiers are not getting the cooperation that they wanted, and that they are burning the town to the ground to punish the locals. And so, a Concordian named Joseph Hosmer said, "Will you let them burn the town down?" Meanwhile, back in the town, the threat is not nearly as grave as what it seems from the outskirts of town near the North Bridge. Yes, there are British officers in town, but it's John Pitcairn with a telescope and Francis Smith with a big gut complaining about what a long walk it's been. Yes, there are British Redcoats dumping found musket balls into the mill pond. But after the soldiers leave, they dredge the musket balls right back out. Yes, there are British Redcoats dumping barrels of flour into the mill pond. But after the soldiers leave, they pull the flour barrels right back out. Meanwhile, having finished their reconnaissance on the hill, Pitcairn and Smith go into Wright's Tavern, which still exists in Concord Center even today. And Pitcairn has ordered a brandy, and he's got the snifter, and he had gotten in a fight with an elderly person in Concord and had blood on his finger. Who knows how that happened? Probably something dishonorable. And so he's stirring the snifter with his bloody finger, and like a melodramatic movie villain says, "I hope to stir the Yankee blood so before night." This is what's going on in the town. It's all a bunch of nonsense. The collection of soldiers in the woods near the North Bridge have no way of knowing what's going on in the town. They fear the worst. And so they resolve that they are going to march into the middle of the town for its defense or die in the attempt. And they begin the long and dreadful walk to the North Bridge. As a point of geography, in the town of Concord, in order to get to Barrett's farm from the center, you did need to take the North Bridge. The British Redcoats were onto something. So, the soldiers are marching toward the bridge, but the militia is also marching toward the bridge because they need to use it to get into town to defend it from burning. As the militia is marching down to the bridge, they have the order from Barrett not to fire unless they are fired upon first. And they have a fife and a drum, and they're playing a song called the White Cockade. In the front of the line is Major John Buttrick. His house is part of the National Park Service property. It's just at the top of the hill. Now he is commanding the militia that is going down to face off against the British Army. Now the next company is the Acton Minutemen, led by Captain Isaac Davis. So this becomes a standoff. The British soldiers immediately start trying to pull up the planks of the bridge, which was a common practice, so that the enemy could not cross toward them. They realized that the militia was coming too quickly toward them. They didn't have time for this, and so they had to immediately get into defensive positions and prepare to engage. Well, they fired a few warning shots, which went ineffectually into the river, maybe by design. They ran a formation called street firing, which is a configuration of soldiers with muskets whereby the front two lines can fire as the back two are loading, and you can provide a continual stream of gunfire in a very narrow setting. But in the confusion of the moment, they botched it. And so, next thing you know, the militia is very close to the bridge, and they are about to raise their guns. And so the British deliver their first real volley. Now, I'd like to take a moment to talk about Isaac Davis. He lived in Acton. He was a young man, almost 30, on April 19th, 1775. 4 days later would have been his 30th birthday. He was a gunsmith, and he was a great marksman. As such, he had a favorite gun, one that he just preferred. In all of his military drills and all of his marksman practice, he just loved this one gun. And a few days before April 19th, he happened to notice an owl had perched on his gun and didn't move for days. And he eventually said, "No one disturb it." He sort of wanted to see where this was leading, but he took it as a bad, bad omen. Well, the night of the 18th happens, the alarm comes from Paul Revere, from William Dawes, from Samuel Prescott, from everybody around, and Isaac Davis prepares to lead his Acton Minutemen to Concord. And as he's leaving his house with his soldiers, he stops. He makes everyone wait because he wants to go back to his house to say goodbye to his wife and to ask her to take good care of the children. He had to go. He was the captain of the Acton Minutemen. He was duty-bound, he was useful, he believed in the cause, and so he left his home, he left his wife, he left his kids, and found himself marching down toward the North Bridge. Isaac Davis was killed in the first British volley as he was raising his gun to his chest. A musket ball pierced his heart. Upon seeing Isaac Davis fall and one of Davis's Minutemen, Abner Hosmer, fall, Major Buttrick then said to his soldiers, "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire." And what those Minutemen and militia delivered was such a volley of continuous fire that the British Army on the other side of the North Bridge found themselves wrong-footed and they were routed. They immediately began to retreat. Now, 3 British soldiers were hit in that volley. One of them was carried off by the company. 2 of them were left on the ground on the east side of the bridge. The 2 British soldiers left on the ground are now buried in the ground by the North Bridge. This poem serves as their gravestone. They came 3,000 miles and died to keep the past upon its throne. Unheard beyond the ocean tide, their English mother made her moan. Now, as the British soldiers are retreating from the bridge back into the town to gather themselves, they pass the house of one Elijah Jones, who has seen what has just taken place at the North Bridge and is feeling very brave and is holding a musket out the second-story window of his house. He's just about to fire. His wife knocks it from his hands before he can. Well, he's not satisfied, so he runs down from the upstairs to the downstairs, and now he's shouting at one of the soldiers from his shed. And this soldier, still retreating from the hot fire they just took at the bridge, decides he's just going to try and shoot Elijah Jones. So he haphazardly aims, fires, and misses Elijah Jones' head by 3 feet. That house is now called the Bullet Hole House, and you can see the musket ball still in the wood. Now, in all of this confusion, the light infantry who had been engaged at the bridge and is now retreating suddenly comes upon the Grenadiers coming from Concord Center. Well, why were they so late? Why did they miss all the action? Guess who was leading them? Francis Smith. and he's big, and he's fat, and he's waddling, and he's sweating. And because all of the grenadiers are behind him, they don't make it to the bridge in time to engage the militia. And so now there's this whole kerfuffle with the light infantry coming this way and the grenadiers coming that way, and Smith exasperated in the middle, and he decides, okay, everybody turn around, we're going to Concord again. So they march back into the town square. That pretty much ends the action in Concord. Once Smith decides to take the light infantry and the grenadiers from the bridge back to the town, they leave, and they're heading back toward Lexington. But in the hours that have passed since Paul Revere and William Dawes left Boston to alarm the countryside, thousands of militia and minutemen from every surrounding community, miles and miles away, have been walking and walking and walking toward Lexington, toward Concord, and everywhere along the way. And so, this stretch of road that the British used in the middle of the night to get out here becomes a treacherous battlefield. A couple hundred yards wide, but 16 miles long. And these militiamen and minutemen are hiding behind stone walls, hiding behind trees, raising up to fire, and reloading as they run to a new position. And the British Army was exhausted, they were hungry, they didn't have any idea where they were or why they had even gone. And now, for 16 miles of steady marching, they had to endure horrific sights that are now known as Parker's Revenge, where the Lexington Minuteman led his people to get even for what happened on the Green. They marched through a place called the Bloody Angle, where militia and Minutemen were on both sides of the road, shooting in such a way that they could hit the British Army, but not hit each other. It was a treacherous and awful fight that lasted all the way to sundown. The British Army was lucky to make it back to Charlestown. And once they made it there, the siege of Boston began. That is a different story for a different video. So I'd like to move on to the Minuteman statue at the North Bridge. As the 100th anniversary of April 19, 1775 approached, it was decided by the town of Concord that in addition to the pedestal from 1836, the town wanted to add another monument on the other side of the bridge. So they turned to a local sculptor, Daniel Chester French. He lived in Concord. Now, name recognition alone makes him seem like a natural choice, but he was anything but a natural choice to make this sculpture. In fact, at the time he was given the commission, he was an amateur sculptor. It was a hobby for him. Sure, he had an eye for art, but he certainly was not a professional. His father was a judge in town. Somebody talked to somebody, they said, hey, I think Danny can do it. Well, okay, the town said, we'll give Daniel a chance, but he has to work for free. Well, Daniel Chester French decided to accept this challenge, and so he opened a professional sculpting studio all the way in Boston. Not a short commute, but he was resolute in wanting to do a very professional job. Once Daniel had finished the statue, it was shipped off to Chicopee, Massachusetts, to the Ames Foundry, which was the only place in the country that could create bronze castings. And so they made a mold and they cast this statue in bronze. And the bronze that was used for the statue, 10 cannons captured by New Englanders at the Battle of Louisburg. The poem on the pedestal was the first stanza of the Concord Hymn by Ralph Waldo Emerson. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. In creating the likeness of the Minuteman, it was an easy choice, but it was not an easy task. Daniel Chester French's father, the judge, went to Acton, to the family of Captain Isaac Davis, the first man to fall at the North Bridge that day. There were no sketches of him. There were no portraits of him. But what there were living relatives. A nephew who had his nose, a niece who had his jaw. And after compiling daguerreotypes and sketches of other family members, he brought this source material to his son, Daniel Chester French, and from that, the sculptor created the face of Isaac Davis. It is an iconic image and synonymous with patriotism in the United States. You see the tentative stance with which the Minuteman is leaving his plow and picking up the gun. Well, this face has appeared on coins, postage stamps, insurance company ads, you name it. This is a world-famous image. Now, in doing research about this statue, I found out something that I never knew growing up in this town. Underneath the pedestal, there is a copper box filled with an account of the battle from an eyewitness, coins of the day, postage stamps of the day, the history of the town of Concord, and an account of the making of the statue, right underneath this pedestal. As the 100th anniversary of April 19th approached, the town was abuzz. The copper time capsule box was there, the pedestal was there, the statue was there, the crowds were there, President Grant of the United States was there, Daniel Chester French was not there. He was 25 years old. He was a young man. He had made arrangements to go study for a couple of years in Florence, Italy. Although his presence at the unveiling of the statue might have been appreciated by the public, it was hardly a necessity. His work spoke for him and launched a career that made Daniel Chester French one of the most celebrated sculptors in this nation. How fitting that his first professional work, the Minuteman statue, so aptly captures the spirit of the people whose sacrifice and courage formed this nation. The story of April 19th is one of my favorite stories, and the Old North Bridge in Concord is one of my very favorite places to visit. I have so enjoyed having this opportunity to share this with you. I hope you've had as much fun watching this video as I have had making it. Happy Patriots Day.